Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about what I think is fundamentally really the cornerstone of so much of this class, and that is the First Amendment. It's something that is talked about and kind of thrown around. The idea of First Amendment rights are thrown around so often in so many circumstances. And really, people often don't take a deep dive into exactly what the First Amendment is, what it says, what it covers, and sort of the deep history of how it came to be. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to break this up into two lectures as well. Just again, it can get kind of long, and I want to make sure folks stay focused. So I'm going to do one video now, and we'll do a second part to wrap it up. So let's jump right in. Again, oftentimes we hear freedom of speech, right? First Amendment. I've got freedom of speech, but it's really more than that. So the entirety of the First Amendment, as you see here, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So again, there's a lot packed in there, and we tend to kind of boil it down a lot of times to just that freedom of speech. And even then, it can be kind of a complicated issue to hash out. So again, that's our starting point. It's just an understanding of the depth of the First Amendment itself. Now, we have to go back, obviously, to the history of it all and why the First Amendment was so important. There was a reason that the founding fathers made it right there up front, the first one, because, of course, it was a huge part of breaking away from England. So we look back in the history, and again, the first printing press, with that, there were no rules. It was sort of the Wild West, if you will. And as long as there has been people of authority, there's been opposition to that authority. And so, therefore, a lot of things were being printed against the British government. And it didn't take them too long to realize, hey, this is not good. This is a threat, people wanting to overthrow or push back against the government because they were given information. They were becoming educated about what was happening, and that became a threat to power. So we see in around 1476, the British government begins to heavily restrict the press and put restrictions in place about what is printed. Right, and that's a huge issue. Something called seditious libel laws. We're going to punish those who criticize the government. Now, here's the key: it didn't matter if what they said was true or not. They could be writing absolute truth. It was still against British law, and they would still be punished. Okay. Licensing or prior restraint laws said that for printers to print something, they had to get approval ahead of time. So you can imagine, obviously, if the government didn't want you to print it, they would simply deny the right. So it was completely restrictive of anything that might even not only criticize the government, but even something that might make the government look in an unfavorable light in any way. In fact, so far that printers had to actually put money down, called bonds, but they had to put money down in advance. And after that money was held, if the government decided that something that the printer printed violated the law, or, came out unfavorably, they would actually lose that money. The government would keep it. And then, just in a little deeper level of what certainly would appear to be corruption today, they would actually favorably grant patents and offer monopolies to printers that cooperated with the rules. Because again, even back then, there were printers that were going to be rebellious, that were going to go ahead and print what they wanted anyway, and sort of take their chances and face the consequences. So the government went so far as to even grant favor and curry favor with the government by cooperating with their rules, right? So lots and lots of restrictions in place. And this is important because all of these restrictions that they were living under really drive that desire as they break away, and then the founding fathers and start here. That's why the First Amendment became so critically important, because this is what folks were living under prior, right? So keep that in mind. Now we look at colonial America. So we get here. Again, the colonies are still under British rule, and so again, we still have the restricted laws. 1662, again, that prior approval, similar to what they had over there. Licensing, taxes, and again, those sedition laws to control the printer. So even here across the ocean, right, that largely the same restrictions are still in place. Again, taxes rather, just another way to sort of suppress the press, right? Keep them in line, limit them, tamp down what they're writing and saying and how things are being covered. So again, what you're seeing here is just a building of frustration, hostility, and a desire to break away from this sort of control of speech and thought and what's spoken. Lead to a very, very famous trial, famous libel trial. John Peter Zenger rather, published the New York Weekly Journal. Okay, this was a publication, and he was pretty outspoken on his attacks against Governor William Cosby. And the argument was pretty straightforward here. Zenger's lawyer said, you know, you can't imprison somebody for publishing criticism of the government, particularly if it was truthful, right? So if you were going to come out and say obviously provable false things against the governor, that was one thing. The argument the lawyers made was, listen, what he's saying is truthful, it's fair, and therefore you can't jail him. Now, irrespective of that argument, British law is very clear that what Zenger was doing was illegal, right? It was a crime. Pretty straightforward, and yet the jury acquitted him, right? So you may have heard the phrase jury nullification before. So this is an example of jury nullification where the jury looks at the facts and they know that in this case, right, he is guilty, and they just say no. Like we disagree with it on principle, and so despite the facts, we're going to offer the acquittal. Now, there's a lot of things that come out of the Zenger trial, but two important points to think about here is one, we talked about precedent in the earlier video. This case sets great precedent, right? Because a famous line that came out of this trial and it has stuck is the idea that truth is a defense against libel. Right? So as you'll hear it said, absolute truth is a defense against libel. So that's still the standard that applies today, and it began with this trial. So if you are a journalist and you print something and you're sued for libel, if you can prove that what you printed is true, it's just absolute cut and dry. It's offense against the charge of libel. Okay, so a couple things to think about there. Now, again, still in colonial America, this is interesting. Laws that were restricting the press and the printers and so on and so forth, reflecting back on it, a lot of historians say, you know, the press really was quite free. And the thing is, it's all relative, right? It's all perspective. It was more free than it was in England, but it still had heavy restrictions in place, particularly when you compare it to the press that we live with today, right? So, sure, there's sort of degrees of freedom. It wasn't quite as bad as it was, but it was certainly still heavily restricted, even at that point. Now, another interesting element is a lot of times when people talk about First Amendment rights being violated and these sorts of things, they will talk about the government, right? The government's censoring my speech or they're censoring my writing. And then that's true, it does happen. But more often today, you see that it's actually communities and groups and citizenry that is leading censorship efforts. Lots and lots of examples. We might sort of think of what we call cancel culture today, and so oftentimes, a good example that comes to mind is Dave Chappelle, very famous comedian, and has gotten in some trouble through the last several years for some of the jokes he makes. He does a lot of jokes attacking the transgender community. And so, under the First Amendment, free speech, that's all protected speech. And so the government has not tried to come after him, but there's absolutely been organized attempts by the community at large, by the citizenry, by those who are offended by his humor to get him canceled. There was a concerted effort to get Netflix to cancel their agreement with him and protests and different things like that. So a lot of times today, when we think about censorship, not so much coming from the government, although that still exists, but really more of almost a grassroots effort to sort of police speech, if you will. Again, back to the First Amendment, I just want to circle back with a little perspective. Now we kind of see a little more context to all of this, but abridging the freedom of speech. Think about those words because as we continue on, it's sort of subjective, right? How do we decide what abridges the freedom of speech? Should you have absolute freedom of speech and freedom of the press? Are there ever exceptions? Or should absolutely the press be able to print and say anything that they want? And should people be able to say anything that they want? And that's what we're going to cover here going forward. And there's some different theories on what the answer is to that question, right? We're going to touch on 7 different theories of sort of how the First Amendment is intended to be interpreted. And we've talked about that. I think I mentioned in the last talk, the Second Amendment, right? The right to bear arms is constantly interpreted. What did they really mean by that? Do you take it literally, or is it, sort of an evolving concept? And so the same is true for the First Amendment. How are we going to interpret that? So we're going to touch on seven First Amendment theories. And what I'd like you to do as we're talking about these is I want you to just sort of think, where do you kind of land in terms of which one of these aligns most with your beliefs? Okay, so the first one, excuse me, pardon me, is called the absolutism theory. Basically, this is the government cannot censor any reason. There are no exceptions. They absolute believe complete and total freedom. You might think of libertarians, who tend to be people that would fall under the absolutism theory, where they just believe freedom is absolute. There's no interpretation of it. The government cannot do it. That's what it says. That's absolutely what it means. So that's one way to start. The next thing is the ad hoc balancing theory. And the idea here is freedom is very important, but so are other things, keeping the public safe, national security, and we sort of have to weigh those out on a case by case basis. A good one here might be if you look at the Edward Snowden case. If you're not familiar, Edward Snowden was a citizen who worked for the government and leaked hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, uh, revealing a lot of national security secrets. He then fled the country and lives in exile in Russia. But there was a huge debate, and there still is a huge debate on his right to do that. Now, there were organizations that published these documents, and the question becomes, was that exercise of freedom of speech, or was the national security weighing into that a bigger issue? So ad hoc says you've got to look at them both and sort of decide, which is more important. Next up, there's the preferred position balancing theory. Basically, the same as ad hoc, but here we're going to say we're going to start out leaning in the favor of freedom of expression. So we're going to weigh it on a case by case. We're going to look at everything, but we're going to start off with the assumption that your freedom of speech kind of trumps everything else. A very important case, the Supreme Court case from 1969, Tinker v. Des Moines, is a pretty good example of this. And this case involved public school kind of during the height of the Vietnam War. And as an act of protest, they wanted to wear black armbands to school in an organized protest to sort of against what was happening in Vietnam. The school district said no. They said they would suspend them if they did. The students wore them and they were suspended. And so that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And here the preferred position was the idea of yes, the school was arguing there could be disruptions, there could be, riots essentially. And the court had to weigh that against the freedom of the students to express themselves. So again, they weighed them both, but the court started out saying the freedom, the rights of the students started out in the lead, and it was then the government's job to prove their point to come kind of override that. It ultimately ruled that they failed to meet that, and the courts sided with the students and the protest. So that's another interesting one. And again, as we're going through these, think about them and think about where you fall, where you as a person kind of see yourself on the spectrum of how much how many rights should we have under the First Amendment. And next up, the Michael John theory, presented by Alexander Michael John. He was a philosopher, he was an educator, and he believes freedom of expression is a means to self-government. If it doesn't relate to self-government, it's not protected. And so his position was in a nutshell, listen, this was all about escaping British rule and the oppression of the government on the people. And so what the founding fathers really meant was freedom of speech because you've got to be able to speak out against the government. But he didn't think that it really blanketed against everything else. It really was just limited to that. Next up, the marketplace of ideas theory. And this basically said the market figure it out, right? Let them say anything and have that ultimate freedom. And good, it'll stick around. And if it isn't, it will die. If we went back to the Dave Chappelle example, the theory might be if there was going to be a challenge to that is to say, listen, let Dave Chappelle say whatever he wants. And if enough people, if the market is offended by it enough, they'll stop buying tickets to the shows, they'll cancel their Netflix subscription. The market will sort that out and the speech will die. And that's how supporters of that theory believe that you should manage it. Let the people ultimately decide. Number six, the access theory. And this is basically that we don't all have equal access to the marketplace of ideas. And that's not right. Okay. So the theory is that you can't just restrict access to people that have power or people that have wealth. It's got to be open to everybody, and everybody has to have an equal opportunity. So there's a lot of different ways you can interpret this. It can be as far as like, you can go into any courtroom in America, and if there's a trial, which is a public event, it's not just limited to certain members of the press or certain members of influential power people, like anybody, any citizen can go in and sit in the courtroom and watch a court proceeding. Likewise, access to information shouldn't be limited to people that have the money or the means to afford it. So that's why, there's free public television and radio and all kinds of ways to disseminate information and access to information at no cost, right? Because the theory is people all need to have equal access, which we don't always have. And the final one is self-realization, self-fulfillment. Basically, it shouldn't really matter if the speech is important or if it's valuable, that's all sort of subjective. And the idea is you have a right as a human being, as on your journey of self-fulfillment and self-realization, to say whatever you want. And it really shouldn't matter or shouldn't be up to somebody else to decide if there's value or anything like that, right? So that's the final one. So again, interesting, kind of a wide range, all the way from absolute saying, listen, hands off, it is what it is, all the way down to, let the public decide. A lot of people tend to fall in the middle and take that sort of ad hoc idea of, what, it really is case by case. If you think about a good example of um, one of the ideas is the idea that we don't, first of all, just to be clear, we don't have absolute freedom of speech, right? If we were to, for example, um, the famous line, I have to think where it came from. It was Oliver Wendell Holmes said it, but it was the idea of you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? The idea that I mean, that speech. If I stand up in a theater and scream fire, and people begin rushing to the exits and trampling each other, I'm creating really potential for a lot of danger, right? So yes, it's speech, but the risk, the danger, the clear and present danger is how the courts talked about it, overrules your right to just say whatever you want. Likewise, if you were to, say bomb on a plane, you're going to get arrested, and First Amendment rights are not going to uphold you there. Okay, so just a few other examples to think about, but it's a complicated argument, and really it stirs a lot of debate because people are very passionate about it, and it's a fine line. There's such a history in our country and in many, many other countries around the world of speech being suppressed and people being jailed, people being executed for what they say. And it really becomes just sort of a cornerstone of what people are willing to fight for. So it's important for you to think about it, and you're going to be writing about it. We're going to do discussion boards about it. Is just to think, what is your position on these seven? Where do you think you land? And maybe you land in a mix. It doesn't actually have to be absolutely one, but where do you land? And be prepared to sort of explain why you land there. It's okay to say, I fall into the marketplace of ideas theory, but I want you to be able to explain why. What is it about that theory that appeals to you or aligns with your beliefs, maybe in comparison to some of the other ones? So we're going to take a quick break there, and we'll continue on in a separate video as we continue to talk about the First Amendment.